Hello, BookTube, and welcome to the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. Those of you who have been joining along, we are reading A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman for February. We're doing a monthly book club here, and this is our February pick. A big, fat work of popular history about the 14th century and all of the upheavals that it saw. A calamitous is what Barbara Tuchman calls it, and you can easily see that, especially if you put yourself in the position of an ordinary person living during these years. Because these years saw upheavals of a fundamental existential nature. There was war, of course. There was the 100 Years' War. And the thing to remember about the 100 Years' War, as about almost any war, is how brutal it was for the ordinary people, the non-combatants, who didn't care who won or lost and who just wanted to work their land. They just wanted to be left alone. Almost no one was left alone. And some of the brutalities that we even have on record, we can assume that the worst ones weren't recorded, are staggering even by 21st century standards. So there's that. The world of the people on the continent of France in the countries around France that world was upended, violently ruined for countless thousands. But there were other upheavals too, lots of them. And some of them were fundamental to the world. These were rough times economically, for instance, but also you have to keep in mind that your landlord held a lot of sway over you. Your feudal lord, whoever it was, if you were a burgher or someone higher on the social ladder, your feudal lord held a lot of sway over you. But that was what we would call secular. The vast other part of your life, the internal part, the part that ruled your thoughts, your daydreams, your worries, your fears, the part that literally circumscribed your day, your week, your year, your calendar, was the church. We lose sight of it we're in a much more secular age, but it was the whole of the inner, imaginative, personal, moral world of the people involved here. And the church had two upheavals at this time. One was very signal, which is that suddenly there were two popes. Suddenly there was a papacy in Avignon. And suddenly it was possible to ask, which pope are you loyal to? Which pope are you referring to? Which was that the formation of even that question was unthinkable to most of the people who lived at this time. Suddenly they had to deal with it. Suddenly they had to deal with the fact that there were two popes. And what does that do to your faith? If you've held it as the bedrock of your own personal existence for the whole of your life, for the whole of your family's life, what does that do? But also there was a huge amount of corruption in the church, reaching gigantic, epic proportions at about this time. Could not be ignored, could not be buried under euphemism. There was no way to take a kindly look towards it. Barbara Tuchman has a wonderful chapter. I hope you'll put up with me reading bits and pieces to you from this book, because it's just too good not to. She has a wonderful bit about the prevalence of clerical abuse, clerical incompetence, people who couldn't read the scriptures, who couldn't read the liturgies that they were reciting every week, had no idea what they were doing, had just been promoted for the money in an outfit, a church that was intensely secular. But she has a passage here. In the tales of Boccaccio, in the Fabliaux of France, in all the popular literature of the time, clerical celibacy is a joke. Priests lived with mistresses, or else went in hunt of them. A priest lay with a lady who was wed to a knight, begins one tale matter-of-factly. In another, a priest and his lady went off to bed. In the nunnery where Piers Plowman served as cook, Sister Purnell was, quote, a priest's wench, who bore a child in cherry time. Boccaccio's rascally friars were invariably caught in embarrassing situations as victims of their own lechery. In real life, their sinfulness was not funny, but threatening. For when a friar failed so far in holiness, how could he save souls? A very important point. We laugh at it because a lot of great comic writers at the time embodied it in comic literature, but it was a serious thing. We shouldn't lose sight of how fundamental it was. This sense of betrayal explains why the friars were so often the subject of active hostility, sometimes even of physical assault, because, as a chronicle of 1327 stated simply, they did not behave as friars ought. So those were two major upheavals at this time, two sides of the same upheaval about the church. And this was taking place at a time where social norms were in some ways very different from our own. And Tuckman is all over that. She's all about that. She has a remarkable ear for those differences, those structural differences in the way people lived. She points out at one point something that a lot of us take for granted about our present time. Where is it here? Yes, never was man less alone. Even in bedrooms, married couples often slept in company with their servants and children. Except for hermits or recluses, privacy was unknown. So we've come full circle, right to the present moment. A lot of young people have no conception of privacy. They have no idea what it means to have private information. They just don't have. They don't have any idea what it is, nor have they ever been penalized for not knowing what it is. So we've come partially full circle when it comes to that, but I think that is still really fascinating. I want to move on to another quote here, a couple of them, because in addition to the rift of the basic bedrock of the church, and in addition to war, and in addition to famine and shortage, it gets a little bit of short shrift in this book, but only because of another slight failing on the part of the book that we'll get to in a minute. In addition to all of that, there was also something else, right? And if you know anything about the 14th century, you know about that something else. The Black Death reached Europe from the east, invaded from the ports and coastlines, crossed the Channel and reached England, and wreaked havoc. And partially you can see why, right? That earlier quote, people lived right on top of each other, and their children, and their livestock. Privacy was unknown. Seclusion was largely unknown. The basic tenets of fighting a virulent viral outbreak, at least for most people in the 21st century, the basic tenets, quarantine, isolation, social distancing, those were not only for the most part unknown in the 14th century, but also physically impossible. So when the Black Death hit, it hit hard. It wiped out a huge percentage of the population of Europe and England. A gigantic percentage of the population died in a very short amount of time. The plague came. There were two variations, as we've talked about, one far more quickly lethal than the other, but there was no treatment for either one of them, no help, no prevention, and it kept coming in waves in the mid-14th century. And I have a part that I want to... I have a couple of parts that I want to mention here. One is a chronicler, Agnolo di Tura, who Barbara Tuckman is fantastic at finding these people and unearthing their excerpting their writings perfectly. And she writes, in Siena, where more than half the inhabitants died of the plague, think about that, half the people in the town. Work was abandoned on the great cathedral, planned to be the largest in the world, and was never resumed, owing to the loss of workers and master masons and the melancholy and grief of the survivors. The cathedral's truncated transept still stands in permanent witness to the sweep of death's scythe. Agnolo di Tura, a chronicler of Siena, recorded the fear of contagion that froze every other instinct. Quote, father abandoned child, wife, husband, and brother another, he wrote, for this plague seemed to strike through in the breath and sight, and so they died. And no one could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. I, Agnolo di Tura, called the fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so did many others likewise. Sort of stoically put, but it betokens a huge amount of agony, right? I mean, that cannot be avoided. I have another example here. Oh, no, the other example that I want to give you, there are plenty of other examples here. The chapter, the long stretch introducing the Black Death is harrowing reading, even now. Even as many times as I've read this book, just harrowing. But I want to read another bit about, I missed it the first time, about the corruption of the church, this time coming from the Pope, Clement VI, who he burst out against his prelates in a tirade of anger and shame when they petitioned him in 1351 to abolish the mendicant orders. And if he did, the Pope replied, what can you preach to the people? If on humility you yourselves are the proudest in the world, puffed up, pompous, and sumptuous in luxuries. If on poverty you are so covetous that all the benefices in the world are not enough for you. If on chastity, But we will be silent on this, for God knoweth what each man does, and how many of you satisfy your lust. And Tuckman mentions, in this sad view of his fellow clerics, the head of the church died a year later. So the corruption in the church and the explosion in the church, the schism in the church, suddenly 2 popes, and rampant disease, and, as I mentioned, the 100 Years' War, which this is not a dedicated account of that war. So we don't get a centralized narrative, but we do get the high points and the low points. We get the parts that will fit into any thumbnail history of the war. And a big one of those in the part that we're reading today. For this first week, we're reading the first half of the first part of this book. There are 2 parts. We're breaking those 2 parts up to 4. So roughly 8 chapters a week, something like that. Although a lot of you have read ahead, I've been very, very happy to read how many of you are enjoying this. In a way exactly like you would enjoy any novel, any fantasy novel, anything like that. I'm taking particularly pointed enjoyment of the Note of Surprise. A great number of you have said that you are reading this and really loving it, and a great number of that number have said, I'm surprised that I'm enjoying it. I was thinking that this wasn't for me, that this whole kind of reading wasn't for me. I've been saying all along, it is. If you are reading a work of history and it is dry or forbidding or making you feel like a fool, it's failing. You're not failing. It's failing. This book never does that. So it's a perfect example of what I'm talking about accidentally. But Tuckman, when she has to, she does touch on the 100 Years' War. And specifically, the centerpiece in the chapters that we're reading for this week is the Battle of Poitiers, which is a massive English victory against a steamroller French military, a military that should not have lost. On paper, should not have lost. And we get a little meditation of that. The segments are really, really good. We get a little meditation. Why the fight? Why the defeat? To Villani in Italy, the extraordinary event seemed unbelievable. Petrarch, the famous poet Petrarch, who she accesses all throughout this book, learning about it in Milan on return from a journey, was no less stunned. The English themselves thought their victory a miracle, and succeeding generations have found it hard to fathom. Militarily, French numerical superiority was nullified by a failure of command. And she goes into that. She goes into the failure of command and how that might work. In a study of the Battle of Poitiers that is really good. You could find pointed, monograph-style histories on it that give you a lot more detail. One of the reasons that we don't get a lot of that detail in this book is connected with one narrative technique here that I don't think works as well as it should. I think that Barbara Tuckman should have abandoned it. And that is, she centers a lot of this narrative on one man, Enguerrand de Coucy, a kind of rapacious wolfman baron that to her typifies a lot of the elements of the age. I think probably that typification was started by his connection with the Black Death, and that Tuckman then just broadened it out from there. And I think probably it was a historian's narrative decision to make this less formidable, to make this more inviting, put a human face on it, that sort of thing. Plenty of historians and biographers do that. And it's often done well. It's done really well in this book. We certainly know as much about this guy as we'd ever want to know. We know as much about him from history as you could possibly know. He's not worth knowing, is one of my objections. He's clearly a loathsome, savage brute. And no matter how much he identifies with the key events of his age, war or the nobility or the plague or whatnot. But in addition to that, I think that using him as a way to put a face on the narrative and make it more accessible to readers is Barbara Tuckman underestimating her own narrative ability. We don't need him. This book pulls you in easily without him. And I'm wondering, here in this first week, a lot of you have got this far, I'm wondering if you're agreeing with that. You are, in the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club, you are allowed to disagree with me. You aren't allowed to do that on my channel. But you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to disagree with me for the book club. And I'm wondering if any of you, when the narrative diverts to tell us a lot of details about Enguerrand de Coucy, do you feel in those sections like, I don't need this? I don't need you to tell me all about him. I'm okay. I'm okay with just a narrative of the 14th century. I don't need you to put a human face on it. Do you feel that way, or were you happy about that? Were you happy about that anchoring presence? I found that in this read-along, it annoyed me more than it has in earlier read-alongs, that element of it. But the rest of it, oh my. Like I said, I was worried at first about making the first choice in my only book club a big work of history. of medieval history. I was worried at first about doing that because I know that a lot of you, you're all energetic, enthusiastic readers, but thanks to pedagogy, thanks to the academy, thanks to bad teaching, history is often characterized, even for enthusiastic and energetic readers, as a preserve behind a high wall. And maybe if I study enough, I can get a key to that door and start to read the books that are behind that wall. That is absolutely not true. But institutes of academia, my bête noire, often do encourage that kind of thinking. It was only after I picked this book that I realized that might be true and that I might lose people that way, which is why all the emails that I've been getting, people saying, I started this, it's been on my shelf forever, or I got a copy, didn't think that it was a book for me, but oh my God, it is. It's utterly fantastic. I can't wait to read more. That has pleased me a lot. That has been a vindication of this choice and a vindication of the line that I have been canting to people since long before there was an internet, which is that academic characterization of history writing is not true. No matter how much the Academy wants to make it true by writing work after work after work of boring, inaccessible history. They've tried to make it that way. But you get a historian who comes along, a Barbara Tuchman, Samuel Eliot Morison, you can go back to Prescott or Parkman. You get a historian who wants to tell you a great story that is well researched but is also narratively alive, you're not going to have that problem. So I'm glad about this. I'm very glad that this has worked. But I want to know what you're thinking. These first 8 or 9 chapters of the first part of the book are very much meaning to set the table. They are very much meaning to sort of give you a big, broad overview look at the 14th century. Is it working for you? Did it work for you? I'm assuming that for most of you it has. Most of you are hooked. But anyway, I want to hear about it, and I will no doubt be talking about this in the course of the week. But next weekend, I'll make another video. I'll make a video, I guess we could call it official. I don't really know how to do a book club, but I'll do another video next weekend about the second half of the first part of A Distant Mirror, and we'll talk about more stuff then. But feel free to bombard the comments and to email me. Just remember the one and only rule of the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club, which is that if you're thirsty, and the first place you go for a drink is actually, keep it to yourself. I've had 2 emails only. I've had hundreds of emails on the subject. I've only had 2 that have been wrong. Just wrong. No way about it. It's not subjective. They were just wrong. I don't want to hear how simplistic a book this is, and I don't want to hear how, we're on the same side. It's good that you're humoring all of these people who are doing this book club. I hate you if you think that way. Plain and simple. Why should I mince words about it? That is a loathsome way to think about this sort of thing. It's unbelievably snobbish. If you are a snob when it comes to reading history, if your first thought when I mentioned Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror is, isn't that a little simple? This isn't the book club for you, is all I'm saying. And I'll just put it that way. This is not the book club for you. Don't email me with emails like that, and don't leave comments like that. But that's been almost non-existent, which is great. I would hope that it's non-existent, and that is very much the tone and tenor that I've set on this channel for 6 years. But I wanted to stress it for this club, that we're not going to do that. This is a friendly, fun book club. And it's been working. So I want to hear all about it. You can email me. You can leave me a message on Voxer. Not enough of you leave me messages on Voxer. Why should poor Britta and young Micah bear all the burden? And also you can leave comments on this video. I'm dying to see what you think of the beginning. Now that we're officially started, I'm dying to think. And we'll move on to the next 8 or 9 chapters next week. So I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.